Hello, welcome crew. This is the Voices of Titanic podcast premiere episode, and I'm your host, Sam. Thank you so much for joining me today. Before we get started on this week's episode, I want to give you an idea of the format and what to expect each week. My plan is to cover a passenger and or a passenger's family that was with them on the ship, or a crew member each week. Whether they were a victim of the sinking or they survived, I want to give voices to the lesser known stories or the stories that have been erased. There are passengers and crew members that I have never even heard of. I found that out at the Titanic anniversary weekend event that I attended this month. There were some survivor descendants there, and I had never heard of these people, and they were all third-class passengers. So that got me thinking, how many second-class, third-class immigrant passengers and crewmen and women do we not really know much about or hear about too often? Maybe you hear a name here and there, but we don't know their full story. So that is my plan, is to honor those who were on the ship. And this week is going to be a little different. For the premiere episode, I wanted to do the voice of the Titanic. Because of that, I'm not going to be focusing too much on the people. That will be the entire series. For this segment, I want to focus on the Titanic's short life, her birth, her death, her discovery, and her lasting legacy. It felt appropriate to me to start there because the Titanic was not only the backdrop for this disaster, but when you think about it, she was also a victim that night. And with that being said, let's get started. Let's travel back in time to a world where commercial airliners were not a thing. Ocean liners were the primary way of intercontinental travel. There was a growing number of immigrants coming to North America, as well as wealthy travelers, and this made the transatlantic passenger trade a very profitable and competitive market. Two big names in the industry were Cunard, which still exists, and White Star Line. Cunard had debuted two lovely ladies, the famous Lusitania and Mauretania. White Star managing director J. Bruce Ismay's response to his rival company's newest ships was the Olympic class. This class consisted of 3 ships. This included the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic, formerly known as the Gigantic. The Olympic class ocean liners would offer luxury and comfort as their main selling points rather than the speed that was offered by Cunard's newest creations. While the Titanic was about comfort, she could still make the transatlantic crossing from Southampton to New York in a week's time. While the RMS Titanic, RMS stands for Royal Mail Ship, was a registered British ship, she was owned by American John Pierpont, or J.P. Morgan, who was one of the most successful businessmen in the world. His company had actually acquired the White Star Line in 1902. So it's pretty interesting to wrap your mind around. We think of the Titanic as a British ship, but she was in fact American owned and built in Ireland. So pretty interesting fact. Her first keel plate was laid on March 31st, 1909, and her construction began at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Titanic and her big sister Olympic were built side by side and especially made gantry to accommodate their large sizes, and were both designed by the legendary Thomas Andrews of Harland and Wolff. We will definitely be talking about him in another episode. I love him. Titanic was assigned 401 as her hull number. Approximately 14,000 Irishmen were hired to build both ships. Titanic, upon completion, was the largest movable man-made object in the world at the time. The Titanic was nearly 883 feet long. You have to imagine that is almost 4 city blocks. She was 92.5 feet wide, 175 feet tall from the waterline to the top of her 4 funnels, or stacks. Her 4th smokestack was a dummy stack. So it was there to give the impression of size and power, but it did have a function. It was used to also vent smoke from the Titanic's galleys and to provide some extra ventilation for the kitchens and smoking room. Her gross tonnage was 46,329 tons. Her speed was 21 to 24 knots, and she was built for a maximum of 3,510 passengers and crew. Titanic carried 14 standard lifeboats, 2 emergency boats, and 4 collapsible boats. All in all, the lifeboats could hold 1,178 passengers and crew, which actually surpassed the Board of Trade requirements at the time. We will get to that a little bit later, but I'm sure you can already hear that the calculations, the math is not adding up with the amount of passengers the ship can carry and the lifeboat capacity. As for her safety features, the ship had a double hull of 1-inch thick steel plates and 15 watertight bulkheads that divided the ship into 16 compartments. The doors to the compartments could be closed from the bridge in case water breached the ship's hull, and the Titanic was designed to withstand 4 flooded compartments, this is important to remember for later, without threatening the buoyancy of the liner. Although they were called watertight, the compartments were not actually capped at the top, so if water filled up one compartment, it would just spill over into the next, as the bulkheads only reached about 10 feet above the waterline. It took over a year to fully frame the ship. More than 3 million rivets were used to hold the Titanic's steel plates to her frame, and most of the work was amazingly carried out manually by a 5-person riveting team. The hull weighed a grand total of 26,000 tons and contained more than 2,000 portholes. In October of 1910, the shell plating was completed. In her hull, the Titanic contained 29 boilers with 159 furnaces, which powered 2 reciprocating engines. This is pretty amazing, but the reciprocating engines were the largest ever built at the time. They were nearly 40 feet tall, and the boilers were also something to marvel at, standing 2 stories high. She had what was called a triple screw propulsion. Screw is another word for a propeller. She had 3 bronze propellers that weighed a total of 93 tons. Her central propeller was approximately 17 feet and weighed 22 tons, while the other 2 were 1.5 times larger and weighed 38 tons. Titanic was released from her dry dock in May of 1911, and work on her interiors began. A crowd of nearly 100,000 excited onlookers watched the Titanic glide into the water for the first time. It took 10 months to decorate and fit out her interiors. Multiple styles were used in her decor: Louis XIV, Empire, Italian Renaissance, Georgian, Regents, Queen Anne, and Old Dutch. Her accommodations were quite opulent and modern. The liner contained an immense first-class saloon that was as wide as the ship, a Turkish bath, a squash court, a heated swimming pool, electric light and heat, electric elevators, and a gymnasium with a mechanical horse and camel. She also had 2 musical ensembles and 2 libraries. There was a library for first class and one for second class, and she had a reading and writing room and a barber shop. I think it's fair to say one of the most iconic features of the ship is the first class grand staircase. This spanned 6 stories of the ship, and of course, you think of the opulent and extraordinary glass dome. The grand staircase was paneled in oak, while the dome was made of wrought iron and milk glass. During the day, it was lit with natural light, and during the evening, it was illuminated with crystal lights. I can't even imagine how beautiful that must have been. On the uppermost landing, there was a panel containing a large clock surrounded by the figures of honor and glory crowning time. I have a replica from the movie of the clock on my wall, and it's a really beautiful piece. I love it so much. First-class passengers could dine at chic offerings such as the Palm Court and Veranda restaurants and the Café Parisien. First-class passengers would eat 10 or more course meals, that's a lot to compute. That's a lot of food. I've had maybe 3, maybe 4 course max. 10 or more that's a lot of food, but I mean, talk about luxury, right? Third class meals were much simpler, but were far superior than most options at sea. Titanic was one of the first ships to offer multiple meals a day for third class passengers. Unlike other ships, Titanic offered comfortable accommodations for third class passengers that surpassed what they may have even experienced back in their own homes. How much did it cost to purchase a ticket on board the Titanic? She had 2 parlor suites, also known as the Millionaire Suites. They were the most expensive on the ship and cost a whopping $4,350, which doesn't sound like a crazy amount, but in today's money, it was over $100,000. One of these suites was occupied by White Star Line Managing Director J. Bruce Ismay. A regular first-class ticket, on the other hand, would have set you back a minimum of $3,500 in today's currency, while a second class ticket would cost you approximately $2,028 today. Lastly, a third class ticket on Titanic cost $40, which is approximately $1,200 in today's money. On February 3rd, 1912, she was cleaned and painted, and on April 2nd, 1912, she completed her sea trials and was ready for her maiden voyage and what would tragically be her final and only voyage at sea. RMS Titanic was captained by Edward J. Smith, deemed the millionaire's captain due to his popularity with wealthy passengers. White Star Line's newest creation created a lot of publicity for her maiden voyage. This ship drew in both American and British elite, industrialists, and many immigrants hoping to start a new chapter in America. For immigrants looking to start anew, and I think this is what is so heartbreaking to me about the immigrant story, is that this ship really was the ship of dreams for them. It was bringing them to a new world full of opportunities. On April 10th, 1912, her first and last voyage would begin in Southampton, England at noon. Her departure was quite exciting as she nearly collided with the nearby SS New York. So due to the Titanic's increasing speed as she's leaving, a suction developed in the crowded channel. SS New York began to drift toward the Titanic, and according to witnesses, the New York's lines snapped like rubber bands, and it sounded a lot like gunshots. And I do believe some people actually got injured when this happened. With this steamship free in the water, an impact seemed inevitable, but thankfully the Titanic reversed her engines in time, and nearby tugboats that had just escorted the Titanic were able to cast their lines to the New York and pull her away from the large ocean liner. For some, this incident was looked at as a bad omen of things to come. Due to the incident with the SS New York, Titanic's departure was delayed and she did not arrive in Cherbourg, France until nightfall. More passengers boarded in Cherbourg and more bags of mail were loaded on. The next day, on April 11th, the ship made it to Queenstown, Ireland, to pick up the last of her passengers. At 1:30 p.m. on the same day, the ship headed out into the open ocean toward New York City. She would never see land again. On board were approximately 2,200 souls. Due to a mild winter in 1912, an exceedingly large amount of ice had broken free from the Arctic region. Because of this, on Sunday, April 14th, Titanic's wireless operators had received 5 ice warnings, and although Captain Smith had used some preventative measures and altered course further south, the ship carried on at a speed of 22 knots. At around 9:40 p.m. that Sunday night, a 6th ice warning was received from the ship the Masaba. Sadly, this warning never made it to the bridge and therefore did not reach Captain Smith. I don't know if it would have altered the course of events that night if he had received it, but it is something to think about. At 10:55, the nearby Californian messaged that it had stopped for the night due to an ice field. According to witnesses, it was a calm, clear, and moonless night, which actually made it more difficult to see icebergs in the area because there's little water breaking at the base. And unfortunately, the binoculars that normally would have been in the crow's nest were missing. At 11:40 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg dead ahead. First Officer William Murdoch was contacted on the bridge and ordered the ship hard a starboard, meaning the ship was to turn to port, which is left, and to reverse her engines. Tragically, the ship was too close to avoid a collision, and her starboard, or right, side scraped along the iceberg. 6 of her watertight compartments were ruptured, meaning over 200 feet of the ship was now exposed to the sea, because remember, she couldn't take on water in more than 4 compartments. Once ship designer Thomas Andrews had assessed the damage, the Titanic's fate became apparent. She would inevitably founder. Water from the damaged compartments would continue to spill over into the other compartments, leading the ship's bow to drop deeper into the Atlantic, and it was only a matter of time, a mathematical certainty, that she would sink. Somewhere between 12:10 and 12:20 a.m. on April 15th, Captain Smith asked the wireless operators to send out a distress call asking for assistance. The distress signal CQD, followed by Titanic's call letters MGY, were sent across the waves. One of the ships responding to the call was one of Cunard's own, the Carpathia. She was on her way, but sadly was nearly 58 nautical miles away, which means she would have taken about 4 hours to get there. Other ships that responded were Titanic's own sister, the Olympic, but she was 500 miles away, while the Frankfurt was over 170 miles away. As the Titanic took on more water, Lifeboats were being lowered into the sea, and there was an order for women and children first. Officer Lightoller took it literally as women and children only, and Officer Murdoch took it as, okay, women and children first, but if there are men around who are ready to get into a boat, put them in as well. Although Titanic's number of lifeboats exceeded the amount required by the British Board of Trade, her boats were still filled well below capacity. So, for example, lifeboat number 7, the first to leave, it held 27 passengers, but it had a capacity for 65 people. Crewmen had worried about how much weight the davits could hold in a fully loaded boat, and Officer Lightoller himself didn't know the new davits had even been tested in Ireland. There was also supposed to be a scheduled lifeboat drill that day, and it was canceled. I mean, of all days, right? On top of that, most of the passengers did not initially believe that the Titanic was really sinking. Many had thought she dropped a propeller blade. And we have to remember, this was late at night, it was dark, it was incredibly cold, and that deterred people from leaving what most thought was a safe ship, and according to the press, an unsinkable one at that. We also have to take into account that families were forced to separate, wives from their husbands and children from their fathers. People didn't want to leave their loved ones behind, which was completely understandable. Titanic's musicians had begun playing in the first-class lounge, but eventually they made their way out onto the boat deck to play for passengers. At 12:45 a.m., the first rockets were lit. Deep in the belly of the ship, many brave crewmen in the boiler and engine rooms continued to risk their safety and their own lives to keep the lights on and the pumps working. By 1 o'clock a.m., water was seen at the base of the grand staircase. After 1:30 a.m., the ship's bow was so below the surface that her massive propellers were now visibly out of the water. The decks and portholes were still lit, and music drifted across the water to those in the lifeboats. Passengers in the lifeboats at one point started hearing this loud roar coming from the Titan ship, and it was everything from pianos to silver to china crashing forward as the stern was lifting up. At nearly 2 a.m., the last of Titanic's rockets were fired, and all lifeboats had left except for collapsibles C and D. As the clock struck 2:15 a.m., water crashed to the once opulent grand staircase and her wrought iron and glass dome. As sounds of tearing metal rippled through the area, the forward funnel of the ship collapsed toward the bow. The remaining passengers that clung to the stern began sliding off into the water. At approximately 2:18 a.m., the Titanic's lights went out. Suddenly, the grandest and biggest ship in the world began to split apart between the third and fourth funnels. As the ship broke in two, the bow slid beneath the water. Researchers estimate it took approximately 5 to 10 minutes for the bow to reach the Atlantic Ocean floor as it traveled at 30 miles per hour. As this happened, the rear of the ship settled back into the water momentarily before rising once again. Those left behind clung to anything they could get their hands on. The stern remained vertical and motionless, hauntingly frozen for anywhere between seconds and several minutes before making the final plunge, increasing in speed as it descended. At 2:20 a.m., the RMS Titanic was gone, and over 1,500 lives were lost. The Titanic was never to be seen again until 73 years later. On September 1st, 1985, a joint U.S.-French expedition, including oceanographer Robert Ballard, discovered the wreckage of the Titanic at 13,000 feet beneath the surface. The bow was recognizable, while sadly the stern was a shattered mess. If you've seen photographs or Ken Marshall's recreations and his paintings, the stern is just obliterated. But despite this, many of the ship's features were still relatively well preserved. Hundreds of thousands of pieces of debris were strewn about the 2-square-mile radius surrounding the wreckage. While several thousand artifacts have been recovered, the beloved ship is sadly deteriorating as I speak. Her iron is being consumed by iron-eating microorganisms, and many of her more notable features are now gone or have collapsed. The ship has also suffered damage from multiple submersibles visiting the wreck site. In 1986, the United States passed the RMS Titanic Memorial Maritime Act. It treated the wreckage as an international maritime memorial and hoped to regulate activities involving disturbing the wreck site. In 1987, the American company RMS Titanic Inc. salvaged nearly 1,800 artifacts. Unfortunately, in the late 1990s, and I say unfortunately because we're not talking about researchers or scientists, this is for tourists, tourists could pay large sums of money to visit the sunken ship. At the time, tickets cost $36,000 to ride in a submersible, and by the early 2020s, the cost had risen dramatically to $250,000 per ticket. In 2012, the Titanic became the subject of the Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage. According to the United Nations website, quote, "The wreckage of the passenger liner Titanic will now be protected by United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization Convention that seeks to safeguard wrecks, sites, decorated caves, and other cultural relics underwater." In June of 2023, the Titan submersible imploded during its descent while visiting the Titanic, killing 5 people, including a 19-year-old boy. The remains of the Titan were tragically found approximately 1,600 feet from the Titanic herself. In 2024, RMS Titanic Inc. visited the wreck and took more than 2 million photographs and discovered some of the bow's railing has already fallen apart. In positive news, they found the bronze statuette of the goddess Diana, which had not been seen since 1986, so that's pretty incredible. Titanic's lasting impact on popular culture cannot be ignored. She is the subject of countless books, including some really spectacular ones like A Night to Remember by Walter Lord. That's one of my favorites. Another favorite of mine is Titanic in Illustrated History by Don Lynch and illustrated by Ken Marshall. She's also been featured in many films, most notably A Night to Remember from 1958, and James Cameron's Oscar-winning mega hit Titanic. It's also my favorite movie of all time. There was Saved from the Titanic in 1912, which actually featured real-life survivor Dorothy Gibson. She was an actress, and she actually wore the dress that she was rescued in on the Carpathia. There is Titanic, a 1943 Nazi propaganda film. I've seen it. I think you can find it on YouTube. It is ridiculously inaccurate, but it's worth the experience, I guess. There's Titanic from 1953, another classic, and the poorly received 1980 flop Raise the Titanic. There are numerous Titanic exhibits around the world. Most famously, there's Titanic Belfast. It's a museum and a hotel located in the former Harland and Wolff shipyard. Fingers crossed, I'm really hoping to go next year. I've never been. I've been to the exhibit in Las Vegas, San Francisco, and I'm hoping to attend the newly opened one in Portland, Oregon this year. It opened, I believe, March 21st and runs until sometime in October if you're interested. While Titanic's condition may be ever declining, she will never be forgotten, and I think we can confidently say that. She's the topic of yearly conventions. Like I mentioned earlier, I attended the Titanic anniversary weekend on the Queen Mary, and it was absolutely spectacular. I was fortunate enough to meet survivor descendants and legends like Don Lynch and Ken Marshall. There are thousands, maybe millions of Titanic enthusiasts out there. I've seen lots of online groups. We have a big community, a big family, and it was really special to meet like-minded people at this event who have a passion for this ship. We can continue to keep her legacy alive with our books, our movies, our shows, our podcasts, and our artwork. The Titanic was more than a disaster. She was more than a 20th century Greek tragedy. The Titanic represented hope. She represented promise. She was a symbol of opportunity for hundreds of immigrants looking to start a new life. She was the symbol of a long-gone era. In my eyes, and I think you can agree, the Titanic was larger than life. She had a personality. She had a soul. She was the great ship of transatlantic travel, bringing dreamers to their new homes. What her designers and her builders created was a marvel and a true accomplishment. As Ken Marshall said in Ghost of the Abyss, she was, quote, the epitome of human engineering and architecture. She was the ship of dreams. I would like to pause for a second and have a moment of silence for the Titanic, a beauty whose life was full of promise and cut far too short. Let us honor her and the thousands of lives that were lost with her. Thank you so much, crew, for joining me in today's episode. As we disembark, I wish you happiness, love, and peace. Take care, and I'll see you next time on the Voices of Titanic podcast.